Hello, my name is Ian Arden. I'm here to talk to you today on the subject of plastic waste, the truth behind the hysteria. My credentials for this are that I am both a chartered engineer and a chartered environmentalist who has worked with the waste industry for over 40 years and has been teaching on the subject in UK universities for the past 15 years. I didn't pick the title of this webinar, but it certainly covers the material which I want to present to you today very well. David Attenborough's recent environmental documentaries have highlighted the problems associated with plastic waste, and especially its impact on marine ecology. The subject has never previously been escalated to this level in the public consciousness, and never before has the response been quite so hysterical. And yet, there is nothing new about this. Many of us have known of the problem for many years. Nevertheless, it's surely good and right that we, the people who created the plastic waste in the first place, should find far-reaching solutions to at least reduce and hopefully eliminate the problem. Sadly, most of the proposals made so far, for example, reducing single-use plastic bags, banning plastic drinking straws, cotton buds, and drink stirrers, while not insignificant, are at best dealing with the symptoms of the problem, not with the problem itself. My guess would be that most of you listening to me would find little difference in a world that contains none of the aforementioned plastic items. I've certainly managed to live largely without them for the past 20 years. Nevertheless, it sometimes takes some strong statements to wake us up. Of course, we need to address the problem of any type of waste, but dealing with plastic is the one where societally we have failed most dismally. As National Geographic, in its excellent June 2018 edition, Planet or Plastic, stated, 18 billion pounds of plastic ends up in the ocean each year. That's about 9 megatons per year in SI units. The magazine goes on to describe the rapid growth of plastic production globally since just 1950. This happens to correspond with my own lifetime, and I can understand why younger people nowadays are so concerned for their futures. To me, perhaps the most frightening part of the graph shown is the area in pink at the bottom right. This represents only packaging waste, which today accounts for around 1/2 of all the plastic produced globally. And this is only very rarely recycled into other material items or into energy, yet much of it is entirely avoidable. National Geographic states further, production of plastic has come at a breakneck pace. Virtually half of the plastic ever manufactured has been made in the past 15 years. Why is this? Simply because we, the consumers, find plastic immensely convenient, more hygienic, hugely more portable, and above all other considerations, incredibly cheap. And there is nothing that we in the UK like more than cheap. It's almost a national obsession. I wonder if any of you have ever visited or had to visit a pound or discount store. It's very instructive to do so. I did a survey of one of my local stores recently. You see the pictures here, and was astonished to find that I had to walk along 3 or 4 full aisles of the store before I came to the first items for sale that were not made from plastic or coated with plastic and or wrapped in plastic. This is a massive societal problem. Many people in the UK, especially those on low incomes, have little choice but to shop in discount stores. Leaving aside the many items in such stores that one can easily live without, many lives are heavily dependent on plastics and will be for the foreseeable future, no matter what legislation might be enacted. As an engineer, I have no doubt that in time we will discover new and sustainable wonder materials to replace existing hydrocarbon plastics, but any currently available replacement materials will be bulkier, heavier, less hygienic, and crucially, considerably more expensive. Finding new materials to replace so-called plastic is beyond the scope of this webinar. We must focus on what can now be done in the immediate future to help to alleviate the present problem. Removing the plastic waste we have already allowed into the oceans and elsewhere will prove exceptionally hard, and all that we are likely to be able to do with it is move it elsewhere, which is not dealing with the problem. Present legislation, especially in the UK, is based heavily on moving the problem somewhere else rather than dealing with it ourselves. And most new proposals I've seen follow the same pattern. Let's move even more of the problem somewhere else and deal with it at some future unspecified date, assuming that we haven't let even more of it slip through the net and back into the ocean. If we want to take the plastic waste problem seriously, we have to stop trying to deal with the effects of the problem and look at the causes of the problem. As an engineer, the first thing I would do is to conduct what we call a root cause analysis. However, we would find in doing this that there is no such substance as plastic. This is not a promising start, since all current legislation seems to be based on the assumption that there is. A dictionary definition of the term plastic shows any of a group of synthetic or natural organic materials that may be shaped when soft and then hardened, including many types of resins, resinoids, polymers, cellulose derivatives, casein materials, and proteins, used in place of other materials such as glass, wood, and metals in construction and decoration, for making many articles as coatings or drawn into filaments for weaving. This clearly shows that the word plastic refers to a type of material, not the material itself. And as so often happens in the English language, we are misusing plastic as a catch-all term, which includes substances as chemically different as, for example, polythene, polystyrene, polyvinyl chloride, polyethylene terephthalate, to name just some of the common ones. Genuinely dealing with these different substances requires each individual type to be handled separately. Otherwise, we are simply exacerbating the problem. As an example of our imprecise thinking on definitions, see this scan of a magazine wrapper I recently received, which claims, "I'm plastic-free." Well, full marks to English Heritage for producing a magazine wrapper made from potato starch, which is so much more sustainable than oil-based hydrocarbons, that's a real step forward. But it's also a very misleading claim, because according to the foregoing definition, it is still clearly a plastic material doing the jobs that plastics do. A great maxim, which I have closely followed for many years, is reputedly borrowed from the McKinsey Corporation. It says, if you cannot define it, you cannot measure it. If you cannot measure it, you cannot manage it. I'll repeat that. If you cannot define it, you cannot measure it. If you cannot measure it, you cannot manage it. If we're serious about finding genuine solutions to the plastic problem, we must first define plastic correctly. Among the hydrocarbon polymers that we most commonly group as plastic are shown on this slide in descending order of proliferation on the planet. 6 majors: low-density polyethylene at 20%, polypropylene at 19%, high-density polyethylene at 14%, PET at 11%, polystyrene at 6%, and PVC at 5%. There are also a large number of minors grouped together under other, which include such commonly known materials as nylon, and these make up the remaining 25% of the waste material. We talk glibly about recycling plastics as a means of dealing with the problem, and we shall look at the definition of recycling later. However, each and every one of the different types of so-called plastic listed here requires a radically different method of recycling. Other than a few PET bottle blowing plants in the UK, we have virtually no facilities for the repolymerization of other types of plastic. We've therefore resorted to exporting much of our plastic waste, particularly to Asian markets for so-called recycling. Actually, from all the evidence, it seems that little is actually recycled in those countries either. We know that much of it is burnt, often in non-environmentally friendly ways, and much is lost in watercourses from where it finds its way into the oceans. The UK exporting its problem waste is not the same thing as the UK dealing with its problem waste. So what do we mean by this term recycling, which is bandied about so much? Well, unfortunately, it's become one of the worst defined words in the English language. Back in the 1990s, many of us in the industry were calling for a waste hierarchy to help in the decision-making process of optimizing waste management. The most common way of expressing this was as a diagram showing the 5 R's, as you see here. This was first reduce, then reuse, then recycle, then recover, and finally reject, the last being what we were all trying to avoid. We were all quite clear what these various tiers meant, as is shown on this slide. The first priority, reduce, simply meant do not generate the waste items in the first place. The second priority, reuse, means another use, for finding another use for the same item. The third priority, recycle, means turn into a different item. Fourth, recover usually refers to the recovery of heat and power. And the final tier of reject usually means disposal in a landfill. Unfortunately, over the intervening years, government departments, notably DEFRA, have tried to tweak and embellish the waste hierarchy to suit their own purposes, and have ended up subtly changing even the meaning of the words. The waste hierarchy was then taken over by many local authorities who wanted to use it to help them manage their own municipal waste streams. It's not clear how it came to pass, but somewhere along the line the original intention of the waste hierarchy has been lost. It is notoriously difficult to reduce waste. This really has to be done by designing waste out of the system, something which governments, departments and local authorities are not in an ideal position to do, so it's been largely ignored. The second tier, reuse, is also difficult in a sophisticated throwaway society like the UK, and many cases of reuse are not visible and do not appear in any records, so it is difficult to quantify. This has led to local authorities focusing primarily on the third tier, recycling, with the fourth and fifth tiers being seen as stages to avoid. It's perhaps understandable, as there are political incentives for this, but it has destroyed the original intention of the waste hierarchy. You cannot start the waste hierarchy in the middle. It is progressive. The problem has been compounded by central and local governments having set targets for recycling, but not for any of the other tiers, which is exceptionally confusing. Because these targets are exceedingly hard to measure and achieve, the very meaning of recycling has been massively changed in order to be able to reach the target. Nowadays, in many local authorities, the recycling figures claimed merely represent the amount of waste that has been source separated and or collected, which is barely the first step along the route to recycling. This problem covers all waste streams, but is particularly acute for so-called plastic waste due to the absence of plastic recycling plants referred to above. As a result, most plastic waste cannot be dealt with under the proximity principle, which is supposed to be applied to waste management, resulting in most plastic waste in the UK being exported to other countries. This is not recycling, although it often appears in the statistics as such. Unless and until there is greater transparency regarding these destination markets for plastic waste, this problem is not really capable of being resolved. The problem is not new. In December 2008, IMechE published a groundbreaking report, Energy from Waste, a Wasted Opportunity, in which, among other things, the problems with exporting paper and plastic waste to countries such as China was highlighted. This revelation was taken up at the time in the national press, particularly by the Daily Telegraph, and an open public debate on the subject followed for some weeks. Here you see the headline, "Recycled Waste Shipped to China as Cheap Fuel." It culminated towards the end of the month of January in 2008, 2009, with the claim that recycling adds to warming So the debate was quite extensive. This, of course, was soon forgotten, and the UK continued to ship very large quantities of paper and plastic waste to China and other Asian countries for the next decade. These graphs show the figures from for paper. I don't have the equivalent graphs for plastic because they're just not publicly available, but they are at least as dramatic as these. However, in 2018, the Chinese government decided that it was not prepared to continue to take any more of this low-grade waste and started to refuse further shipments. Since then, efforts have been made to find other, mainly Asian countries to take our waste previously sent to China, but it appears that these countries also are not interested in taking our waste off our hands. The solution to this dilemma is difficult to foresee. It would take a lot of time and money to build the appropriate recycling facilities in the UK, and as previously mentioned, each plastic waste stream has to be dealt with in a different way. However, one thing is certain. The UK cannot go on claiming as recycled waste which has not been in any way recycled. This problem will not go away. And of course, recycling is not the only way to deal with plastic waste. Eliminating plastic from the supply chain, reduce, would preclude the problem arising, but this would take a very long time and does nothing for all the plastic already in the oceans, for example. Reuse on a large scale would make a difference. Refilling containers with liquids, for example, is relatively simple, and many plastics can be used over and over again. However, looking again at this chart of different types of plastic, it is evident that only two types, PET and HDPE, are relatively easy to recycle. The others vary in difficulty and complexity up to such materials as PVC, which are virtually impossible to recycle and also cause problems with recovery. In this context, the term non-recyclable means just that. It does not mean that with a bit more effort, you can recycle it. This is perhaps where the confusion by misdefinition of the word has been most unhelpful. If all recycling means is sorting and collection, then clearly these non-recyclable items are recyclable because they can indeed be sorted and collected. But that does not in any way solve the problem. On the other hand, many of the plastic types which are indeed non-recyclable make excellent fuel and can be used to produce much needed sustainable heat, power and light. This also has the benefit of entirely removing this plastic material from the supply chain, where it will not enter again into watercourses and oceans. In conclusion then, we need to totally rethink our approach to plastic waste. It is clearly not ethical to avoid our national responsibilities by continuing to ship our waste to developing countries, even if they would accept it. The proximity principle requires that we must deal with our own problems ourselves. In April 2009, IMechE produced a further document, Waste as a Resource, which had clear recommendations to government on the way forward in terms of ethical waste management. Among these were proposals to modify the waste hierarchy to reduce the somewhat artificial distinction between recycling and recovery. This slide shows an attempt to come up with a workable waste hierarchy based on our 2009 report. And it shows at the top as the first priority, reduce and prevent. As a second priority, reuse and refurbish. Third being recycle and or recover. And only then the final reject that none of us wish to do with our valuable resources. The 2009 report came up with 3 proposals for government. First, to replace the waste hierarchy, as I've just shown, to make it more useful and relevant to what we are trying to do. Second, to deal with all waste streams, not just household waste, but particularly nowadays we would think in plastic waste. And finally, to adopt a zero-to-landfill approach and publish independently audited, transparent data on the recovery and destination markets of materials and energy in the form of heat, transport, and electricity. This has never happened. I think that's a shame, because we highlighted this as a way forward a decade ago. Had these 2 IMechE reports of a decade or so ago been taken seriously by central and local government and implemented, the UK would be in a much better place today in terms of managing plastic waste. However, legislation over that decade has exacerbated rather than helped the situation, and it is noteworthy that the world has produced far more plastic waste during that period than ever before. We will not achieve the desired outcomes by merely doing more of what we already are doing wrong. A radical rethink of the way we deal with plastic waste is required. Only then can we face our children and grandchildren and tell them we did something worthwhile. When I worked in New York City in the 1980s, the president of the company had a large sign on his desk as a greeting. It said, "Are you here with the answers, or are you part of the problem?" He meant it, and it's a question that I've constantly asked myself ever since. I will leave that question with you to answer yourself today. Thank you for listening. Well, that's the end of the presentation. This is Ian Arden, available for any questions. I've had a couple come through so far, but before I start, let me just apologize for some of the transitions early on in the presentation, which didn't quite work, but I hope that didn't spoil the understanding of what I was saying. The other thing I'd like to mention is that you'll probably have seen a great deal in the media over the past few weeks of the problem with waste being exported to Malaysia and other places. And these would have been brilliant examples to include in this webinar had it not been for the fact that the news broke shortly after I had pre-recorded it. So it's very much an endorsement of what I've already said rather than in any way contradicting it, but that's why I didn't include it in the webinar itself. All right, well, the questions are coming in thick and fast now. I don't know how many I'll get through, but one says, says, while making clothing, footwear, and other fashion items out of recovered plastic is politically laudable, how effective is this? If plastics are not perpetually recyclable ecologically, then what is the best end use for recovered material? Well, indeed, I think that's a very good question. The fact is that we don't produce a great deal of new material from recovered plastics. I mean, there is some, of course, but in the overall picture, it's small. And my own view is that we would probably be, rather than spending a lot more energy on trying to recycle plastics into other materials, we would probably be better focusing on taking plastics out of the supply chain as much as we can, certainly single-use plastics. And this is probably better dealt with by using it as a fuel than by simply trying to recycle it. Another question, are there any plans for building more plastic recycling centres in the UK? How much do they cost and what's their lead time? Is it worth pursuing this in conjunction with redesigning plastics out of the system, or would you propose a different approach? Well, as already stated, plastics like PET and high-density polyethylene are reasonably easy to recycle, and bottle blowing plants exist. More could be built, of course, and the introduction of deposits on plastic bottles will help to do that. I think it's a good step forward. Other plastics, it's very difficult to see where a business would get a return on its investment, because there is not a huge market for recycled plastics, and you use a lot of energy that we don't have in abundance in the UK in recycling those plastics. So another question, which is I fully expected. Surely there are emissions issues with burning plastic for energy. Well, of course, there are emissions issues with any combustion process, and using plastic as a fuel is no different in that respect from using any other material as fuel. If plastics are properly dealt with in a modern energy from waste plant, as they would have to be by law in this country, then the emissions would be governed by the European Union's Waste Incineration Directive, or WID, and the emissions limitation values in WID are extraordinarily stringent, 10 times more so than for a fossil fuel-fired power station, for example. And so the emissions are very closely controlled. And this is why existing plants that are doing exactly this in other parts of the European Union are held in high regard by the residents of those countries. It's just normal life for them, and countries like Denmark, Germany, Sweden do this all the time, and they are certainly as environmentally conscious as we are in the UK, if not more so. I think another question, why are governments reluctant to follow the guidance set out by IMechE? Are they too difficult or expensive? Well, this is a very good part of the very good question. I was heavily involved with the two reports that I mentioned, and was one of the people involved in trying to lobby government on the subject, and we had some success, and particularly with the opposition parties at the time, but more so than the government of the day. But I think the reason why it's difficult is that governments tend to listen to the people who shout loudest, and the people who shout loudest and are listened to tend not to be the professional engineering institutions. I'm not quite sure why that is, but it's something I've remarked upon many, many times over the years as we produce different reports of different types. Engineers generally are not considered to know what they're doing, whereas certain other lobby groups who have little specialist knowledge on the subject are. That's not an easy one for me to explain because I don't understand it myself, but it seems to be the way things are. So I wish I could say that I see that changing in the future, but I think we have current evidence that pressure groups are more successful in gaining the ear of government than the professional engineering institutions are. Another question, should the reject part be eliminated and a full circular economy pushed forward? Should reject be changed to something like convert, to a different use, e.g. construction or something of such? Well, yes, I think in an ideal world that would be the case, and you look at the waste management statistics that are published by Eurostats. You will see that countries like Denmark, Germany, Sweden have reduced their landfill percentages to very, very low values, virtually eliminated in some cases. And that seems to me to be a good way forward, but you won't achieve that, and I think this is the point I was trying to make in my presentation, you won't achieve that by focusing purely on recycling, which is what we've done in the UK. So I see setting unachievable recycling targets as running counter to the objective of trying to achieve a circular economy. I'm a great fan of the circular economy, but recycling in its as we do it at present does not fit in with the circular economy. There's a lot of myth about that. Most of the recycling we do at present is actually downcycling, and downcycling is not a component part of the circular economy. So I think we just need to analyze what we're doing, and by all means, let's push for a circular economy, but a real one, not just jump on that bandwagon. Another interesting question, are all plastics burnable and suitable for energy generation? What are the issues of burning these plastics? Well, most of the substances that we call plastic are burnable, and we do it already. There is any country that has energy from waste plants is burning plastic as part of the mix of the fuel. We would be talking here about increasing that level, so we would have to make sure that the boilers are designed for that. But in principle, there's no reason why more plastics could not be burned. They're mainly hydrocarbon and are very good fuels. The one big exception, as I mentioned in the presentation, is Pvc Polyvinyl Chloride, which, because of the chlorine content, will cause problems in burning, but then it causes problems everywhere anyway. So I think PVC is probably something we should try to eliminate from the supply chain sooner rather than later. Another very good question. What would you suggest to be the best method of trying to raise awareness of the plastic problem if in an engineering workplace? In terms of raising awareness with the higher-ups? Yeah, well, that's a very good question, and I wish I knew the answer to that. Speaking as somebody who has been a higher-up, and I have run a few companies in my time in the engineering sector, I have to accept that I was perhaps rather more enlightened than on this subject than some other people are. But quite honestly, if we as engineers are not going to change the world in this respect, I'm not sure who can. And I think everybody, I believe, has a duty to do something about this, but I think engineers in particular have, because we have been very slow in general in recognizing the problems of waste and indeed of recognizing how waste can be used as a resource. And as legislation tightens, then I think people are not going to be, people who are running companies in the engineering sector are not going to be able to avoid this problem. So I think all companies in the engineering sector have a duty to start showing some leadership in this respect. This one's a bit beyond where we were in today's seminar, but I'll take it anyway. To what extent do you think biopolymers will play a part in the future of plastics, given the strains that already exist on availability of land for agriculture? Yeah, I mean, I'm because of my general experience with sustainability issues, I'm very aware of the conflict between growing things for energy or petrochemicals or chemicals, competing with agricultural products, and it is a real issue. I think if we're going to continue using what we call plastics, then hydrocarbon plastics have to gradually be changed out for biopolymers, but that will be hard to do. It will be expensive to do, and we probably will need to take or different countries will need to take a view on how much of their land they want to use for feeding people and how much they want to use for other products. That's a good question, very hard to answer. Question here, what is the IMechE doing now, building on its reports of 2008 and 2009? Do you think it is only national and local government that can solve the problem? Well, we are looking to update at least the Waste as Resource report very soon. And there's some work going on that at the moment. So watch this space for that one. And we'd like to use that to also describe what we've learned over the intervening decade. Do you think it is only national and local government that can solve the problem? That's a very good question. I don't want to be dismissive of what's been done so far, because a lot of good things have happened, like educating people in sorting and segregating their waste. And that's essential no matter what we do. But by and large, I don't think local or national government have been successful in their waste management strategies. So I think there's probably need for radical change in this field. And the only way I can see things changing is if we, the consumers and the producers of waste, change our lifestyles, which I'm quite sure none of us want to do, but I don't think we can rely on national and local government to do what needs to be done. They have a poor track record, and I think we need to start doing something better than what's happened so far. Another question here, what's your opinion on replacing plastics with paper bags, cotton bags, etc.? Well, yeah, personally, I certainly see this as a very important thing to do, and it goes along with what I just said about the consumer, us, changing the way we do things. It still astonishes me, doing my shopping in supermarkets, that the number of people who still use lots and lots of first-use plastic bags to take their shopping home. Personally, I have not done that for at least 10 years, probably closer to 20 years. And there are so many other things we can do, but which we're not doing. And there are plenty sustainable materials we can use simply for carrying things home. Where it becomes a lot more difficult is in wrapping meat, for instance, and other produce in plastic, which is done to be more hygienic, is done to be to keep food fresh for longer, increase shelf life, and that's very hard to replace. I'm not quite sure how in the present way supermarkets and are run that we can all turn up with our own containers and get fresh meat put into our containers and for it to be successful. I think it is an area where there needs to be a lot more research, and it will require change on the part of supermarkets, but more importantly, it would require massive change on the part of the consumer as well. So I keep coming back to this point. Another question: how does the UK compare with our European colleagues in managing plastic waste stream? Anything to learn? Well, I think it's only fair to say that that all European countries have issues with managing plastic waste. It's not easy for anyone, but I think because so many of our, certainly Northern European countries, do a lot more with converting waste materials into energy rather than other products. That they are dealing with much more of their plastic by that route rather than simply shipping it abroad, which is what we've been doing. It's not to say they don't ship anything to other countries. Unfortunately, they do, but not on the scale, as far as I'm aware, not on the scale that we do. Another question: how long would it take to establish an energy from waste stream? Should it be funded by ongoing new tariffs on plastic goods, e.g. single-use bags, and local and national government subsidy? There is a growing number of energy from waste plants in the UK, perhaps not on the scale of our continental neighbours, but it is growing and it is successful, but we certainly need more, and an idea of using the tariffs on plastic goods would be very helpful in that respect. Here's a question that I was expecting. It has been said in various places that somewhere between 80 and 90% of all plastic material in the world's oceans come from a handful of rivers in Asia and Africa. Sorry, I've just lost that. the question's quite long, so I won't go on from there. Yeah, it is certainly, I think, accepted that a lot of the waste that ends up in the Pacific, in particular, is coming from rivers in Asia. But how much of that is locally produced waste, and how much of that is waste that we've shipped to Asia to get it off our patch is debatable. I think an awful lot of waste in the Pacific comes from countries exporting their waste, particularly to China, but to other Asian countries. So while it may be true that that's the route by which the plastic gets into the ocean, it doesn't in any way exonerate us from, because we've helped add to that waste mountain in China and other countries. I read a report just today, I think, saying that there's any amount of plastic waste in the River Mersey near Liverpool, and so I don't think it's true that it's only in the Pacific Ocean that plastic waste is problematic. So there might be some truth in that assertion, but we are far from lily white on that, since we're polluting our own watercourses. Another interesting question, is there anything to be said for recovering from landfill, or is it best left alone? Well, that's a subject which I've had a fair bit of experience, and my own view is that we should not be putting things into landfill that we want to later recover. There is a view expressed by some so-called environmental bodies that putting plastic into landfill to be dealt with at some later stage is much better than using it as fuel in an energy from waste plant. I certainly don't agree with that at all. I think it's just another example of leaving our problems to someone else, and in particularly any definition of sustainability that you look for will talk about not passing on today's problems to the subsequent generations. And if you simply dispose of plastic in landfill for somebody else to deal with in the future, that is exactly what you're doing, and so it defies the very definition of sustainability. Yeah, good question here. In some European states, drinks bottles are made more durable and taken back by shops for reuse. Is there a trade-off between the cost to the environment associated with the energy used in the reuse process versus the effect on the environment of single-use plastics? Well, yeah, I think that is indeed true. I've lived in other European countries, and they were indeed using the deposit system, as of course we did in this country when I was a kid, but went away from it. So I think this will become more and more the norm for plastic bottles, PET and HDPE, and so that is a good way forward. Well, I'm afraid that takes us up to our time. So if I've missed your question, I'm sorry about that, but I hope you enjoyed the presentation.